Part 2, Chapter 14 of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Recording by Andy Minter. The Forsyte Saga 2, In Chancery, by John Galsworthy. Part 2, Chapter 14 Outlandish Night. Soames doggedly let the spring come. No easy task for one conscious that time was flying, his birds in the bush no nearer the hand, no issue from the web anywhere visible. Mr. Polteed reported nothing except that his watch went on, costing a lot of money. Val and his cousin were gone to the war, whence came news more favourable. Dartie was behaving himself so far. James had retained his health. Business prospered almost terribly. There was nothing to worry Soames, except that he was held up, could make no step in any direction. He did not exactly avoid Soho, for he could not afford to let them think that he had "piped off," as James would have put it. He might want to "pipe on" again at any minute. But he had to be so restrained and cautious that he would often pass the door of the Restaurant Bretagne without going in, and wander out of the purlieus of that region which always gave him the feeling of having been possessively irregular. He wandered thus one May night into Regent Street, and the most amazing crowd he had ever seen, a shrieking, whistling, dancing, jostling, grotesque and formidably jovial crowd, with false noses and mouth organs, penny whistles and long feathers, every appanage of idiocy, as it seemed to him. Mafeking, of course, it had been relieved. Good! But was that an excuse? Who were these people? What were they? Where had they come from into the West End? His face was tickled, his ears whistled into. Girls cried, "Keep your hair on, stucco!" A youth so knocked off his top hat that he recovered it with difficulty. Crackers were exploding beneath his nose, between his feet. He was bewildered, exasperated, offended. This stream of people came from every quarter, as if impulse had unlocked floodgates, let flow waters of whose existence he had heard perhaps, but believed in never. This, then, was the populace, the innumerable living negation of gentility and Forsyteism. This was, egad, democracy. It stank, yelled, was hideous. In the East End, or even Soho, perhaps, but here, in Regent Street, in Piccadilly, what were the police about? In 1900, Soames, with his Forsyte thousands, had never seen the cauldron with the lid off, and now, looking into it, could hardly believe his scorching eyes. The whole thing was unspeakable. These people had no restraint. They seemed to think him funny. Such swarms of them, rude, coarse, laughing. And what laughter! Nothing sacred to them. He shouldn't be surprised if they began to break windows. In Pall Mall, past those august dwellings to enter which people paid £60, this shrieking, whistling, dancing dervish of a crowd was swarming. From the club windows his own kind were looking out on them with regulated amusement. They didn't realise. Why, this was serious, might come to anything. The crowd was cheerful, but some day they would come in different mood. He remembered there had been a mob in the late '80s, when he was at Brighton. They had smashed things and made speeches. But more than dread, he felt a deep surprise. They were hysterical. It wasn't English, and all about the relief of a little town as big as Watford, 6,000 miles away. Restraint, reserve, those qualities to him more dear almost than life, those indispensable attributes of property and culture, where were they? It wasn't English. No, it wasn't English. So Soames brooded, threading his way on. It was as if he had suddenly caught sight of someone cutting the covenant for quiet possession out of his legal documents, or of a monster lurking and stalking out in the future, casting its shadow before. Their want of stolidity, their want of reverence. It was like discovering that 9/10 of the people of England were foreigners. And if that were so, then anything might happen.
At Hyde Park Corner he ran into George Forsyte, very sunburnt from racing, holding a false nose in his hand. "Hello, Soames," he said. "Have a nose." Soames responded with a pale smile. "Got this from one of those sportsmen," went on George, who had evidently been dining. "Had to lay him out for trying to bash my hat. I say, one of these days we shall have to fight these chaps. They're getting so damned cheeky. All Radicals and Socialists. They want our goods. You tell Uncle James that. It'll make him sleep." In vino veritas, thought Soames, but he only nodded and passed on up Hamilton Place. There was but a trickle of roisterers in Park Lane, not very noisy. And looking up at the houses, he thought, after all, we're the backbone of the country. This won't upset us easily. Possession's 9 points of the law. But as he closed the door of his father's house behind him, all that queer, outlandish nightmare in the streets passed out of his mind almost as completely as if, having dreamt it, he had awakened in the warm, clean morning comfort of his spring mattress bed. Walking into the centre of the great empty drawing-room, he stood still. A wife! Somebody to talk things over with. One had a right, damn it, one had a right. End of Part 2, Chapter 14.
Part 3, Chapter 1 of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Recording by Andy Minter. The Forsyte Saga 2, In Chancery, by John Galsworthy. Part 3, Chapter 1. Soames in Paris. Soames had travelled a little. Aged 19, he had made the Petit tour with his father, mother, and Winifred, Brussels, the Rhine, Switzerland, and home by way of Paris. Aged 27, just when he began to take an interest in pictures, he had spent 5 hot weeks in Italy, looking into the Renaissance, not so much in it as he had been led to expect, and a fortnight in Paris on his way back, looking into himself, as became a Forsyte surrounded by people so strongly self-centred and foreign as the French. His knowledge of their language being derived from his public school, he did not understand them when they spoke. Silence he had found better for all parties. One did not make a fool of oneself. He had disliked the look of the men's clothes, the closed-in cabs, the theatres which looked like beehives, the galleries which smelt of beeswax. He was too cautious and too shy to explore that side of Paris supposed by Forsytes to constitute its attraction under the rose. And as for a collector's bargain, not one to be had. As Nicholas might have put it, they were a grasping lot. He had come back uneasy, saying Paris was overrated. When, therefore, in June of 1900 he went to Paris, it was but his third attempt on the centre of civilization. This time, however, the mountain was going to Mahomet, for he felt by now more deeply civilized than Paris, and perhaps he really was. Moreover, he had a definite objective. This was no mere genuflection to a shrine of taste and immorality, but the prosecution of his own legitimate affairs. He went, indeed, because things were getting past a joke. The watch went on, and nothing. Jolyon had never returned to Paris, and no one else was suspect. Busy with new and very confidential matters, Soames was realizing more than ever how essential reputation is to a solicitor. But at night and in his leisure moments he was ravaged by the thought that time was always flying and money flowing in, and his own future as much in irons as ever. Since Mafeking night he had become aware that a young fool of a doctor was hanging round Annette. Twice he had come across him, a cheerful young fool, not more than 30. Nothing annoyed Soames so much as cheerfulness, an indecent, extravagant sort of quality which had no relation to facts. The mixture of his desires and hopes was, in a word, becoming torture,
and lately the thought had come to him that perhaps Irene knew she was being shadowed. It was this which finally decided him to go and see for himself, to go and once more try to break down her repugnance, her refusal to make her own and his path comparatively smooth once more. If he failed again, well, he would see what she did with herself anyway. He went to an hotel in the Rue Caumartin, highly recommended to Forsytes, where practically nobody spoke French. He had formed no plan, he did not want to startle her, yet must contrive that she had no chance to evade him by flight. And next morning he set out in bright weather. Paris had an air of gaiety, a sparkle over its star shape, which almost annoyed Soames. He stepped gravely, his nose lifted a little sideways in real curiosity.
He desired now to understand things French.
Was not Annette French? There was much to be got out of his visit, if he could only get it. In this laudable mood and the Place de la Concorde he was nearly run down 3 times. He came on the Cours la Reine, where Irene's hotel was situated, almost too suddenly, for he had not yet fixed on his procedure. Crossing over to the riverside, he noted the building, white and cheerful looking, with green sunblinds seen through a screen of plane tree leaves, and, conscious that it would be far better to meet her casually in some open place than to risk a call, he sat down on a bench, whence he could watch the entrance. It was not quite 11 o'clock, and improbable that she had yet gone out. Some pigeons were strutting and preening their feathers in the pools of sunlight between the shadows of the plane trees. A workman in a blue blouse passed, and threw them crumbs from the paper which contained his dinner. A bonne, coiffed with ribbon, shepherded 2 little girls with pigtails and frilled drawers. A cab meandered by, whose cocher wore a blue coat and a black glazed hat. To Soames a kind of affectation seemed to cling about it all, a sort of picturesqueness which was out of date. A theatrical people, the French. He lit one of his rare cigarettes, with a sense of injury that fate should be casting his life into outlandish waters. He shouldn't wonder if Irene quite enjoyed this foreign life. She had never been properly English, even to look at. And he began considering which of those windows could be hers under the green sunblinds. How could he word what he had come to say, so that it might pierce the defence of her proud obstinacy? He threw the fag end of his cigarette at a pigeon, with the thought, "I can't stay here for ever twiddling my thumbs. Better give it up and call on her in the late afternoon." But he still sat on, heard 12 strike, and then 1:30. "I'll wait till 1, he thought, while I'm about it." But just then he started up, and shrinkingly sat down again. A woman had come out in a cream-coloured frock, and was moving away under a fawn-covered parasol. Irene herself. He waited till she was too far away to recognise him, then set out after her. She was strolling as though she had no particular objective, moving, if he remembered rightly, towards the Bois de Boulogne. For half an hour at least he kept his distance on the far side of the way, till she had passed into the Bois itself. Was she going to meet someone after all? Some confounded Frenchman, one of those bel ami chaps, perhaps, who had nothing to do but hang about women? For he had read that book with difficulty and a sort of disgusted fascination. He followed doggedly along a shady alley, losing sight of her now and then when the path curved. And it came back to him how, long ago, one night in Hyde Park, he had slid and sneaked from tree to tree, from seat to seat, hunting blindly, ridiculously, in burning jealousy for her and young Bosinney. The path bent sharply, and hurrying, he came on her sitting in front of a small fountain, a little green bronze Niobe, veiled in hair to her slender hips, gazing at the pool she had wept. He came on her so suddenly that he was past before he could turn and take off his hat. She did not start up. She had always had great self-command. It was one of the things he most admired in her, one of his greatest grievances against her, because he had never been able to tell what she was thinking. Had she realized that he was following? Her self-possession made him angry, and disdaining to explain his presence, he pointed to the mournful little Niobe and said, "That's rather a good thing." He could see then that she was struggling to preserve her composure. I didn't want to startle you. Is this one of your haunts?" "Yes." "A little lonely." As he spoke, a lady strolling by paused to look at the fountain and passed on. Irene's eyes followed her. "No," she said, prodding the ground with her parasol. "Never lonely. One has always one's shadow." Soames understood, and looking at her hard, he exclaimed: "Well, it's your own fault. You can be free of it at any moment. Irene, come back to me and be free." Irene laughed. "Don't!" cried Soames, stamping his foot. "It's inhuman. Listen, is there any condition I can make which will bring you back to me? If I promise you a separate house and just a visit now and then?" Irene rose, something wild suddenly in her face and figure. "None, none, none! You may hunt me to the grave, I will not come." Outraged and on edge, Soames recoiled. "Don't make a scene," he said sharply, and they both stood motionless, staring at the little Niobe, whose greenish flesh the sunlight was burnishing. "That's your last word, then," muttered Soames, clenching his hands. "You condemn us both." Irene bent her head. "I can't come back. Good-bye." A feeling of monstrous injustice flared up in Soames. "Stop," he said, "and listen to me a moment. You gave me a sacred vow. You came to me without a penny. You had all I could give. You broke that vow without cause. You made me a byword. You refused me a child. You've left me in prison. You still move me so that I want you. I want you. Well, what do you think of yourself?" Irene turned. Her face was deadly pale, her eyes burning dark. "God made me as I am," she said, "wicked if you like, but not so wicked that I'll give myself again to a man I hate." The sunlight gleamed on her hair as she moved away, and seemed to lay a caress all down her clinging cream-coloured frock. Soames could neither speak nor move. That word, hate, so extreme, so primitive, made all the Forsyte in him tremble. With a deep imprecation he strode away from where she had vanished, and ran almost into the arms of the lady sauntering back. The fool, the shadowing fool! He was soon dripping with perspiration in the depths of the Bois. "Well," he thought, "I need have no consideration for her now. She hasn't got a grain of it for me. I'll show her this very day that she's my wife still." But on the way back to his hotel he was forced to the conclusion that he did not know what he meant. One could not make scenes in public, and short of scenes in public, what was there he could do? He almost cursed his own thin-skinnedness. She might deserve no consideration, but he, alas, deserved some at his own hands. And sitting lunchless in the hall of his hotel, with tourists passing every moment, Baedeker in hand, he was visited by black dejection. In irons! His whole life, with every natural instinct and every decent yearning, gagged and fettered, and all because fate had driven him 17 years ago to set his heart upon this woman, so utterly that even now he had no real heart to set on any other. Cursed was the day he had met her, and his eyes for seeing in her anything but the cruel Venus she was. And yet, still seeing her with the sunlight on the clinging china crepe of her gown, he uttered a little groan, so that a tourist who was passing thought, "Man in pain. Let's see, what did I have for lunch?" Later, in front of a café near the Opera, over a glass of cold tea with lemon and a straw in it, he took the malicious resolution to go and dine at her hotel. If she were there he would speak to her. If she were not, he would leave a note. He dressed carefully and wrote as follows: "Your idyll with that fellow Jolyon Forsyte is known to me at all events. If you pursue it, understand that I will leave no stone unturned to make things unbearable for him. S.F." He sealed this note, but did not address it, refusing to write the maiden name which she had impudently resumed, or to put the word Forsyte on the envelope, lest she should tear it up unread. Then he went out and made his way through the glowing streets, abandoned to evening pleasure seekers. Entering her hotel, he took his seat in a far corner of the dining room, whence he could see all entrances and exits. She was not there. He ate little, quickly, watchfully. She did not come. He lingered in the lounge over his coffee, drank 2 liqueurs of brandy, but still she did not come. He went over to the keyboard and examined the names. Number 12 on the first floor, and he determined to take the note up himself. He mounted red-carpeted stairs, past a little salon. 8, 10, 12. Should he knock, push the note under, or... He looked furtively round and turned the handle. The door opened, but into a little space leading to another door. He knocked on that. No answer. The door was locked. It fitted very closely to the floor.
The note would not go under.
He thrust it back into his pocket and stood a moment listening. He felt somehow certain that she was not there. And suddenly he came away, passing the little salon down the stairs. He stopped at the bureau and said, "Will you kindly see that Mrs. Heron has this note?" "Madame Heron left today, monsieur, suddenly, about 3 o'clock. There was illness in her family." Soames compressed his lips. "Oh," he said. "Do you know her address?" "Non, monsieur. England, I think." Soames put the note back into his pocket and went out. He hailed an open horse cab which was passing. "Drive me anywhere." The man, who obviously did not understand, smiled and waved his whip, and Soames was borne along in that little yellow-wheeled victoria, all over star-shaped Paris, with here and there a pause and the question, "C'est par ici, monsieur?" "No, go on," till the man gave it up in despair, and the yellow-wheeled chariot continued to roll between the tall, flat-fronted, shuttered houses and plane-tree avenues, a little Flying Dutchman of a cab. Like my life, thought Soames, without object, on and on. End of Part 3, Chapter 1.
Part 3, Chapter 2 of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eva Harnick, Pontevedra, Florida. The Forsyte Saga, Volume 2, In Chancery, by John Galsworthy. Part 3, Chapter 2. In the Web. Soames returned to England the following day, and on the third morning received a visit from Mr. Polteed, who wore a flower and carried a brown billycock hat. Soames motioned him to a seat. "The news from the war is not so bad, is it?" said Mr. Polteed. "I hope I see you well, sir." "Thanks, quite." Mr. Polteed leaned forward, smiled, opened his hand, looked into it, and said softly, "I think we have done your business for you at last." "What?" ejaculated Soames. 19 reports quite suddenly what I think we shall be justified in calling conclusive evidence." And Mr. Polteed paused. "Well?" "On the 10th instant, after witnessing an interview between 17 and a party earlier in the day, 19 can swear to having seen him coming out of her bedroom in the hotel about 10 o'clock in the evening. With a little care in the giving of the evidence, that will be enough, especially as 17 has left Paris, no doubt with the party in question. In fact, they both slipped off, and we have not got on to them again yet. But we shall. She has worked hard under very difficult circumstances, and I'm glad she brought it off at last." Mr. Polteed took out a cigarette, tapped its end against the table, looked at Soames and put it back. The expression on his client's face was not encouraging. "Who is this new person?" said Soames abruptly. "That we don't know. She will swear to the fact, and she has got his appearance pat." Mr. Polteed took out a letter and began reading. "Middle-aged, medium height, blue dittos in afternoon, evening dress at night, pale dark hair, small dark moustache, flat cheeks, good chin, grey eyes, small feet, guilty look." Soames rose and went to the window. He stood there in sardonic fury. Congenital idiot! Spidery congenital idiot! 7 months at £15 a week, to be tracked down as his own wife's lover. Guilty look! He threw the window open. "It is hot," he said, and came back to his seat. Crossing his knees, he bent a supercilious glance on Mr. Polteed. "I doubt if that is quite good enough," he said, drawling the words, "with no name or address. I think you may let that lady have a rest, and take up our friend 47 at this end." Whether Polteed had spotted him he could not tell, but he had a mental vision of him in the midst of his cronies dissolved in indistinguishable laughter. "Guilty look! Damnation!" Mr. Polteed said in a tone of urgency, almost of pathos, "I assure you, we have put it through sometimes on less than that. It is Paris, you know. Attractive woman living alone. Why not risk it, sir? We might screw it up a peg." Soames had sudden insight. The fellow's professional zeal was stirred. "Greatest triumph of my career. Got a man his divorce through a visit to his own wife's bedroom. Something to talk of there, when I retire." And for one wild moment he thought, why not? After all, hundreds of men of medium height had small feet and a guilty look. "I am not authorized to take any risk," he said shortly. Mr. Polteed looked up. "Pity," he said, "quite a pity. That other affair seemed very costive." Soames rose. "Never mind that. Please watch 47, and take care not to find a mare's nest. Good morning." Mr. Polteed's eye glinted at the words "mare's nest." "Very good. You shall be kept informed." And Soames was alone again. The spidery, dirty, ridiculous business! Laying his arms on the table, he leaned his forehead on them. Full 10 minutes he rested thus, till a managing clerk roused him with the draft prospectus of a new issue of shares, very desirable, in Manifold and Toppings. That afternoon he left work early and made his way to the Restaurant Bretagne. Only Madame Lamotte was in. Would Monsieur have tea with her? Soames bowed. When they were seated at right angles to each other in the little room, he said abruptly, "I want to talk with you, madame." The quick lift of her clear brown eyes told him that she had long expected such words. "I have to ask you something first. That young doctor, what's his name? Is there anything between him and Annette?" Her whole personality had become, as it were, like jet, clear-cut, black, hard, shining. "Annette is young," she said. "So is Monsieur le Docteur. Between young people things move quickly. But Annette is a good daughter. Ah, what a jewel of a nature! The least little smile twisted Soames's lips. Nothing definite, then. But definite? No, indeed. The young man is very nice, but what would you? There is no money at present. She raised her willow-patterned teacup. Soames did the same. Their eyes met. "I am a married man," he said, "living apart from my wife for many years. I am seeking to divorce her." Madame Lamotte put down her cup. Indeed, what tragic things there were! The entire absence of sentiment in her inspired a queer species of contempt in Soames. "I am a rich man," he added, fully conscious that the remark was not in good taste. "It is useless to say more at present, but I think you understand." Madame's eyes, so open that the whites showed above them, looked at him very straight. "Ah, ça, mais nous avons le temps," was all she said. "Another little cup?" Soames refused, and taking his leave, walked westward. He had got that off his mind. She would not let Annette commit herself with the cheerful young ass until... But what chance of his ever being able to say "I am free"? What chance? The future had lost all semblance of reality. He felt like a fly entangled in cobweb filaments, watching the desirable freedom of the air with pitiful eyes. He was short of exercise, and wandered on to Kensington Gardens and down Queen's Gate towards Chelsea. Perhaps she had gone back to her flat. That, at all events, he could find out. For since that last and most ignominious repulse, his wounded self-respect had taken refuge again in the feeling that she must have a lover. He arrived before the little mansions at the dinner hour. No need to inquire. A grey-haired lady was watering the flower boxes in her window. It was evidently let. And he walked slowly past again, along the river, an evening of clear, quiet beauty, all harmony and comfort, except within his heart. End of Part 3, Chapter 2. Recording by Eva Harnick, Pontevedra, Florida. Chapter 3 of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eva Harnick, Pontevedra, Florida. The Forsyte Saga, Volume 2, In Chancery, by John Galsworthy. Part 3, Chapter 3, Richmond Park. On the afternoon that Soames crossed to France, a cablegram was received by Jolyon at Robin Hill. "Your son down with enteric. No immediate danger. Will cable again." It reached a household already agitated by the imminent departure of June, whose berth was booked for the following day. She was indeed in the act of confiding Eric Cobley and his family to her father's care when the message arrived. The resolution to become a Red Cross nurse, taken under stimulus of Jolly's enlistment, had been loyally fulfilled with the irritation and regret which all Forsytes feel at what curtails their individual liberties. Enthusiastic at first about the wonderfulness of the work, she had begun after a month to feel that she could train herself so much better than others could train her. And if Holly had not insisted on following her example and being trained too, she must inevitably have cried off. The departure of Jolly and Val with their troop in April had further stiffened her failing resolve. But now, on the point of departure, the thought of leaving Eric Cobley with a wife and 2 children adrift in the cold waters of an unappreciative world weighed on her so that she was still in danger of backing out. The reading of that cablegram, with its disquieting reality, clinched the matter. She saw herself already nursing Jolly, for of course they would let her nurse her own brother. Jolyon, ever wide and doubtful, had no such hope. Poor June! Could any Forsyte of her generation grasp how rude and brutal life was? Ever since he knew of his boy's arrival at Cape Town, the thought of him had been a kind of recurrent sickness in Jolyon. He could not get reconciled to the feeling that Jolly was in danger all the time. The cablegram, grave though it was almost a relief. He was now safe from bullets, anyway. And yet this enteric was a virulent disease. The Times was full of deaths therefrom. Why could he not be lying out there in that up-country hospital, and his boy safe at home? The unforsytean self-sacrifice of his 3 children, indeed, had quite bewildered Jolyon. He would eagerly change places with Jolly, because he loved his boy. But no such personal motive was influencing them. He could only think that it marked a decline of the Forsyte type. Late that afternoon Holly came out to him under the old oak tree. She had grown up very much during these last months of hospital training, away from home. And seeing her approach, he thought, she has more sense than June, child though she is, more wisdom. Thank God she isn't going out. She had seated herself in the swing, very silent and still. She feels this, thought Jolyon, as much as I. And seeing her eyes fixed on him, he said, "Don't take it to heart too much, my child. If he weren't ill, he might be in much greater danger." Holly got out of the swing. "I want to tell you something, Dad. It was through me that Jolly enlisted and went out." "How's that?" "When you were away in Paris, Val Dartie and I fell in love. We used to ride in Richmond Park. We got engaged. Jolly found it out and thought he ought to stop it. So he dared Val to enlist. It was all my fault, Dad. And I want to go out too, because if anything happens to either of them, I should feel awful. Besides, I am just as much trained as June." Jolyon gazed at her in a stupefaction that was tinged with irony. So this was the answer to the riddle he had been asking himself, and his 3 children were Forsytes after all. Surely Holly might have told him all this before, but he smothered the sarcastic sayings on his lips. Tenderness to the young was perhaps the most sacred article of his belief. He had got no doubt what he deserved. Engaged! So this was why he had so lost touch with her. And to young Val Dartie, nephew of Soames, in the other camp. It was all terribly distasteful. He closed his easel and set his drawing against the tree. Have you told June?" "Yes. She says she will get me into her cabin somehow. It is a single cabin, but one of us could sleep on the floor. If you consent, she will go up now and get permission." "Consent!" thought Jolyon. Rather late in the day to ask for that. But again he checked himself. "You are too young, my dear. They won't let you. June knows some people that she helped to go to Cape Town. If they won't let me nurse yet, I could stay with them and go on training there. Let me go, Dad." Jolyon smiled because he could have cried. "I never stop anyone from doing anything," he said. Holly flung her arms round his neck. "Oh, Dad, you are the best in the world." That means the worst, thought Jolyon. If he had ever doubted his creed of tolerance, he did so then. "I am not friendly with Val's family," he said, "and I don't know Val, but Jolly did not like him." Holly looked at the distance and said, "I love him." "That settles it," said Jolyon dryly, then catching the expression on her face, he kissed her with the thought, "Is anything more pathetic than the face of the young?" Unless he actually forbade her going, it was obvious that he must make the best of it, so he went up to town with June. Whether due to her persistence, or the fact that the official they saw was an old school friend of Jolyon's, they obtained permission for Holly to share the single cabin. He took them to Surbiton Station the following evening, and they duly slid away from him, provided with money, invalid foods, and those letters of credit without which Forsytes do not travel. He drove back to Robin Hill under a brilliant sky to his late dinner, served with an added care by servants trying to show him that they sympathized, eaten with an added scrupulousness to show them that he appreciated their sympathy. But it was a real relief to get to his cigar on the terrace of flagstones, cunningly chosen by young Bosinney for shape and colour, with night closing in around him, so beautiful a night, hardly whispering in the trees, and smelling so sweet that it made him ache. The grass was drenched with dew, and he kept to those flagstones, up and down, till presently it began to seem to him that he was one of three, not wheeling, but turning right about each end, so that his father was always nearest to the house, and his son always nearest to the terrace edge. Each had an arm lightly within his arm. He dared not lift his hand to his cigar, lest he should disturb them, and it burned away, dripping ash on him, till it dropped from his lips at last, which were getting hot. They left him then, and his arms felt chilly. 3 Jolyons in 1 Jolyon they had walked. He stood still, counting the sounds: a carriage passing on the high road, a distant train, the dog at Gage's farm, the whispering trees, the groom playing on his penny whistle. A multitude of stars up there, bright and silent, so far off. No moon as yet. Just enough light to show him the dark flags and swords of the iris flowers along the terrace edge, his favourite flower, that had the night's own colour on its curving, crumpled petals. He turned round to the house. Big, unlighted, not a soul beside himself to live in all that part of it. Stark loneliness. He could not go on living here alone. And yet, so long as there was beauty, why should a man feel lonely? The answer, as to some idiot's riddle, was because he did. The greater the beauty, the greater the loneliness. for at the back of beauty was harmony, and at the back of harmony was union. Beauty could not comfort if the soul were out of it. The night, maddeningly lovely, with bloom of grapes on it in starshine, and the breath of grass and honey coming from it, he could not enjoy, while she, who was to him the life of beauty, its embodiment and essence, was cut off from him, utterly cut off now, he felt, by honorable decency. He made a poor fist of sleeping, striving too hard after that resignation which Forsytes find difficult to reach, bred to their own way and left so comfortably off by their fathers. But after dawn he dozed off and soon was dreaming a strange dream. He was on a stage with immensely high rich curtains, high as the very stars, stretching in a semicircle from footlights to footlights. He himself was very small, a little black, restless figure roaming up and down, and the odd thing was that he was not altogether himself, but Soames as well, so that he was not only experiencing but watching. This figure of himself and Soames was trying to find a way out through the curtains, which, heavy and dark, kept him in. Several times he had crossed in front of them, before he saw with delight a sudden narrow rift, a tall chink of beauty, the colour of iris flowers, like a glimpse of paradise, remote, ineffable. Stepping quickly forward to pass into it, he found the curtains closing before him. Bitterly disappointed, he, or was it Soames, moved on, and there was the chink again through the parted curtains, which again closed too soon. This went on, and he never got through till he woke with the word "Irene" on his lips. The dream disturbed him badly, especially that identification of himself with Soames. Next morning, finding it impossible to work, he spent hours riding Jolly's horse in search of fatigue. And on the second day he made up his mind to move to London and see if he could not get permission to follow his daughters to South Africa. He had just begun to pack the following morning when he received this letter: Green Hotel, June 13, Richmond. My dear Jolyon, you will be surprised to see how near I am to you. Paris became impossible, and I have come here to be within reach of your advice. I would so love to see you again. Since you left Paris, I don't think I have met anyone I could really talk to. Is all well with you and with your boy? No one knows, I think, that I am here at present. Always your friend, Irene. Irene within 3 miles of him, and again in flight. He stood with a very queer smile on his lips. This was more than he had bargained for. About noon he set out on foot across Richmond Park, and as he went along he thought, Richmond Park, by Jove, it suits us Forsytes. Not that Forsytes lived there, nobody lived there save royalty, rangers, and the deer. But in Richmond Park nature was allowed to go so far and no further, putting up a brave show of being natural, seeming to say, look at my instincts, they are almost passions, very nearly out of hand, but not quite, of course. The very hub of possession is to possess oneself. Yes, Richmond Park possessed itself, even on that bright day of June, with arrowy cuckoos shifting the 3 points of their calls, and the wood doves announcing high summer. The Green Hotel, which Jolyon entered at 1 o'clock, stood nearly opposite that more famous hostelry, the Crown and Sceptre. It was modest, highly respectable, never out of cold beef, gooseberry tart, and a dowager or two, so that a carriage and pair was almost always standing before the door. In a room draped in chintz so slippery as to forbid all emotion, Irene was sitting on a piano stool covered with scroll-work, playing Hansel and Gretel out of an old score. Above her on a wall, not yet Morris-papered, was a print of the Queen on a pony amongst deer-hounds, Scotch caps, and slain stags. Besides her, in a pot on the window-sill, was a white and rosy fuchsia. The Victorianism of the room almost talked, and in her clinging frock Irene seemed to Jolyon like Venus emerging from the shell of the past century. "If the proprietor had eyes," he said, "he would show you the door. You have broken through his decorations." Thus lightly he smothered up an emotional moment. Having eaten cold beef, pickled walnut, gooseberry tart, and drunk stone-bottled ginger beer, they walked into the park, and light talk was succeeded by the silence Jolyon had dreaded. "You haven't told me about Paris," he said at last. "No, I have been shadowed for a long time. One gets used to that. But then Soames came. By the little Niobe, the same story. Would I go back to him? Incredible!" She had spoken without raising her eyes, but she looked up now. Those dark eyes, clinging to his, said as no words could have, "I have come to an end. If you want me, here I am." For sheer emotional intensity had he ever, old as he was, passed through such a moment? The words, "Irene, I adore you," almost escaped him. Then, with a clearness of which he would not have believed mental vision capable, he saw Jolly lying with a white face turned to a white wall. "My boy is very ill out there," he said quietly. Irene slipped her arms through his. "Let us walk on. I understand." No miserable explanation to attempt. She had understood. And they walked on among the bracken, knee-high already, between the rabbit holes and the oak trees, talking of Jolly. He left her 2 hours later at the Richmond Hill gate and turned towards home. "She knows of my feeling for her, then," he thought. Of course, one could not keep knowledge of that from such a woman. End of Part 3, Chapter 3. Richmond Park. Recording by Eva Harnick, Ponte Vedra, Florida.
Part 3, Chapter 4 of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Recording by Andy Minter. The Forsyte Saga 2, In Chancery, by John Galsworthy. Part 3, Chapter 4. Over the River. Jolly was tired to death of dreams. They had left him now too wan and weak to dream again, left him to lie torpid, faintly remembering far-off things, just able to turn his eyes and gaze through the window near his cot at the trickle of river running by in the sands, at the straggling milk-bush of the karoo beyond. He knew what the karoo was now, even if he had not seen a Boer roll over like a rabbit or heard the whine of flying bullets. This pestilence had sneaked on him before he had smelled powder. A thirsty day and a rash drink, or perhaps a tainted fruit, who knew? Not he, who had not even strength left to grudge the evil thing its victory, just enough to know that there were many lying here with him, that he was sore with frenzied dreaming, just enough to watch that thread of river and be able to remember faintly those far-away things. The sun was nearly down. It would be cooler soon. He would have liked to know the time, to feel his old watch, so butter smooth, to hear the repeater strike. It would have been friendly, homelike. He had not even strength to remember that the old watch was last wound the day he began to lie here. The pulse of his brain beat so feebly that faces which came and went, nurses, doctors, orderlies, were indistinguishable. Just one indifferent face, and the words spoken about him meant all the same thing, and that almost nothing. Those things he used to do, though far and faint, were more distinct. Walking past the foot of the old steps at Harrow Bill. "Here, sir. Here, sir." Rapping boots in the Westminster Gazette. Greenish paper. Shining boots. Grandfather coming from somewhere dark. A smell of earth. The mushroom house. Robin Hill. Burying poor old Balthazar in the leaves. Dad. Home. Consciousness came again, with noticing that the river had no water in it. Someone was speaking too. Want anything? No. What could one want? Too weak to want. Only to hear his watch strike. Holly. She wouldn't bowl properly. Oh, pitch them up. Not sneaks. Back her to and bow. He was too. Consciousness came once more with a sense of the violet dusk outside, and a rising blood-red crescent moon. His eyes rested on it fascinated. In the long minutes of brain nothingness it went moving up and up. "He's going, Doctor." "Not pack boots again? Never? Mind your form, too. Don't cry. Go quietly over the river. Sleep. Dark. If somebody would strike his watch." End of Part 3, Chapter 4.
Part 3, Chapter 5 of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eva Harnick, Ponte Vedra, Florida. The Forsyte Saga. Volume 2. In Chancery by John Galsworthy. Part 3, Chapter 5. Soames acts. A sealed letter in the handwriting of Mr. Polteed remained unopened in Soames's pocket throughout 2 hours of sustained attention to the affairs of the new colliery company, which, declining almost from the moment of old Jolyon's retirement from the chairmanship, had lately run down so fast that there was now nothing for it but a winding up. He took the letter out to lunch at his city club, sacred to him for the meals he had eaten there with his father in the early 70s, when James used to like him to come and see for himself the nature of his future life. Here in a remote corner, before a plate of roast mutton and mashed potato, he read: "Dear Sir, in accordance with your suggestion, we have duly taken the matter up at the other end with gratifying results. Observation of 47 has enabled us to locate 17 at the Green Hotel, Richmond. The two have been observed to meet daily during the past week in Richmond Park. Nothing absolutely crucial has so far been notified. But in conjunction with what we had from Paris at the beginning of the year, I am confident we could now satisfy the court. We shall, of course, continue to watch the matter until we hear from you. Very faithfully yours, Claude Polteed. Soames read it through twice and beckoned to the waiter. "Take this away, it is cold." "Shall I bring you some more, sir?" "No, get me some coffee in the other room." And, paying for what he had not eaten, he went out, passing two acquaintances without sign of recognition. "Satisfy the court," he thought, sitting at a little round marble table with the coffee before him. "That fellow Jolyon!" He poured out his coffee, sweetened and drank it. He would disgrace him in the eyes of his own children. And, rising with that resolution hot within him, he found for the first time the inconvenience of being his own solicitor. He could not treat this scandalous matter in his own office. He must commit the soul of his private dignity to a stranger, some other professional dealer in family dishonor. Who was there he could go to? Linkman and Laver in Budge Row, perhaps, reliable, not too conspicuous, only nodding acquaintances. But before he saw them, he must see Polteed again. But at this thought Soames had a moment of sheer weakness. To part with his secret, how find the words? How subject himself to contempt and secret laughter? Yet, after all, the fellow knew already. Oh, yes, he knew. And feeling that he must finish with it now, he took a cab into the West End. In this hot weather, the window of Mr. Polteed's room was positively open, and the only precaution was a wire gauze preventing the intrusion of flies. 2 or 3 had tried to come in and been caught, so that they seemed to be clinging there with the intention of being devoured presently. Mr. Polteed, following the direction of his client's eye, rose apologetically and closed the window. "Posing ass," thought Soames. Like all who fundamentally believe in themselves, he was rising to the occasion, and, with his little sideways smile, he said, "I have had your letter. I am going to act. I suppose you know who the lady you have been watching really is?" Mr. Polteed's expression at that moment was a masterpiece. It so clearly said, "Well, what do you think?" But mere professional knowledge, I assure you, pray forgive it. He made a little half-airy movement with his hand, as who should say, such things will happen to us all. "Very well, then," said Soames, moistening his lips. "There is no need to say more. I am instructing Linkman and Laver of Budge Row to act for me. I don't want to hear your evidence, but kindly make your report to them at 5 o'clock, and continue to observe the utmost secrecy." Mr. Polteed half closed his eyes, as if to comply at once. "My dear sir," he said. "Are you convinced?" asked Soames with sudden energy, "that there is enough?" The faintest movement occurred to Mr. Polteed's shoulders. "You can risk it," he murmured. "With what we have and human nature, you can risk it." Soames rose. You will ask for Mr. Linkman. Thanks, don't get up." He could not bear Mr. Polteed to slide as usual between him and the door. In the sunlight of Piccadilly he wiped his forehead. This had been the worst of it. He could stand the strangers better. And he went back into the city to do what still lay before him. That evening in Park Lane, watching his father dine, he was overwhelmed by his old longing for a son to watch him eat as he went down the years, to be taken on his knee as James on a time had been wont to take him, a son of his own begetting, who could understand him because he was the same flesh and blood, understand and comfort him, and become more rich and cultured than himself, because he would start even better off. To get old like that thin, grey, wiry, frail figure sitting there, and be quite alone with possessions heaping up around him, to take no interest in anything, because it had no future and must pass away from him to hands and mouths and eyes for whom he cared no jot. No! He would force it through now, and be free to marry and have a son to care for him before he grew to be too like the old man, his father, wistfully watching, now his sweetbread, now his son. In that mood he went up to bed. But lying warm between those fine linen sheets of Emily's providing, he was visited by memories and torture. Visions of Irene, almost the solid feeling of her body, beset him. Why had he ever been fool enough to see her again, and let this flood back on him, so that it was pain to think of her with that fellow, that stealing fellow? End of Part 3, Chapter 5, Soames Acts. Recording by Eva Harnick, Ponte Vedra, Florida.
Chapter 6 of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simon Evers. The Forsyte Saga 2, In Chancery, by John Galsworthy. Part 3, Chapter 6, A Summer Day. His boy was seldom absent from Jolyon's mind in the days which followed the first walk with Irene in Richmond Park. No further news had come. Inquiries at the War Office elicited nothing, nor could he expect to hear from June and Holly for 3 weeks at least. In these days he felt how insufficient were his memories of Jolly, and what an amateur of a father he had been. There was not a single memory in which anger played a part, not one reconciliation, because there had never been a rupture, nor one heart-to-heart confidence, not even when Jolly's mother died. Nothing but half-ironical affection. He had been too afraid of committing himself in any direction, for fear of losing his liberty, or interfering with that of his boy. Only in Irene's presence had he relief, highly complicated by the ever-growing perception of how divided he was between her and his son. With Jolly was bound up all that sense of continuity and social creed of which he had drunk deeply in his youth, and again during his boy's public school and varsity life, all that sense of not going back on what father and son expected of each other. With Irene was bound up all his delight in beauty and in nature, and he seemed to know less and less which was the stronger within him. From such sentimental paralysis he was rudely awakened, however, one afternoon, just as he was starting off to Richmond, by a young man with a bicycle and a face oddly familiar, who came forward faintly smiling. "Mr. Jolyon Forsyte? Thank you." Placing an envelope in Jolyon's hand, he wheeled off the path and rode away. Bewildered, Jolyon opened it. Admiralty, probate and divorce. Forsyte v. Forsyte and Forsyte. A sensation of shame and disgust was followed by the instant reaction, "Why, here's the very thing you want, and you don't like it." But she must have had one too, and he must go to her at once. He turned things over as he went along. It was an ironical business. For whatever the Scriptures said about the heart, it took more than mere longings to satisfy the law. They could perfectly well defend this suit, or at least in good faith try to. But the idea of doing so revolted Jolyon. If not her lover indeed, he was in desire, and he knew that she was ready to come to him. Her face had told him so. Not that he exaggerated her feeling for him. She had had her grand passion, and he could not expect another from her at his age. But she had trust in him, affection for him, and must feel that he would be a refuge. Surely she would not ask him to defend the suit, knowing that he adored her. Thank heaven, she had not that maddening British conscientiousness which refused happiness for the sake of refusing. She must rejoice at this chance of being free after 17 years of death in life. As to publicity, the fat was in the fire. To defend the suit would not take away the slur. Jolyon had all the proper feeling of a Forsyte whose privacy is threatened. If he was to be hung by the law, by all means let it be for a sheep. Moreover, the notion of standing in a witness-box and swearing to the truth that no gesture, not even a word, of love had passed between them, seemed to him more degrading than to take the tacit stigma of being an adulterer, more truly degrading, considering the feeling in his heart, and just as bad and painful for his children. The thought of explaining away, if he could, before a judge and 12 average Englishmen, their meetings in Paris and the walks in Richmond Park, horrified him. The brutality and hypocritical censoriousness of the whole process, the probability that they would not be believed, the mere vision of her whom he looked on as the embodiment of nature and of beauty, standing there before all those suspicious gloating eyes, was hideous to him. No, no. To defend a suit only made a London holiday and sold the newspapers. 1,000 times better accept what Soames and the gods had sent. Besides, he thought honestly, who knows whether, even for my boy's sake, I could have stood this state of things much longer. Anyway, our neck will be out of Chancery at last. Thus absorbed, he was hardly conscious of the heavy heat. The sky had become overcast, purplish, with little streaks of white. A heavy heat drop plashed a little star pattern in the dust of the road as he entered the park. Phew, he thought. Thunder. I hope she's not come to meet me. There's a ducky up there. But at that very minute he saw Irene coming towards the gate. We must scuttle back to Robin Hill, he thought. The storm had passed over the Poultry at 4 o'clock, bringing welcome distraction to the clerks in every office. Soames was drinking a cup of tea when a note was brought in to him. Dear Sir, Forsyte v. Forsyte and Forsyte. In accordance with your instructions, we beg to inform you that we personally served the respondent and co-respondent in this suit today at Richmond and Robin Hill, respectfully. Faithfully yours, Linkman and Laver. For some minutes Soames stared at that note. Ever since he had given those instructions he had been tempted to annul them. It was so scandalous, such a general disgrace. The evidence, too, what he had heard of it, had never seemed to him conclusive. Somehow he believed less and less that those two had gone all lengths. But this, of course, would drive them to it, and he suffered from the thought. What fellow to have her love where he had failed? Was it too late? Now that they had been brought up sharp by service of this petition, had he not a lever with which he could force them apart? But if I don't act at once, he thought, it will be too late, now they've had this thing. I'll go and see him. I'll go down. And, Sick with nervous anxiety, he set out for one of the new-fangled motor cabs. It might take a long time to run that fellow to ground, and goodness knew what decision they might come to after such a shock. If I were a theatrical ass, he thought, I suppose I should be taking a horsewhip or a pistol or something. He took instead a bundle of papers in the case of Magenty versus Wake, intending to read them on the way down. He did not even open them, but sat quite still, jolted and jarred, unconscious of the draught down the back of his neck, or the smell of petrol. He must be guided by the fellow's attitude. The great thing was to keep his head. London had already begun to disgorge its workers as he neared Putney Bridge. The ant-heap was on the move outwards. What a lot of ants, all with a living to get, holding on by their eyelids in the great scramble. Perhaps for the first time in his life Soames thought, I could let go if I liked. Nothing could touch me. I could snap my fingers, live as I wished, enjoy myself. No, one could not live as he had and just drop it all, settle down in Capua to spend the money and reputation he had made. A man's life was what he possessed and sought to possess. Only fools thought otherwise, fools and socialists and libertines. The cab was passing villas now, going a great pace. 50 miles an hour, I should think, he mused. This'll take people out of town to live. And he thought of its bearing on the portions of London owned by his father. He himself had never taken to that form of investment, the gambler in him having all the outlet needed in his pictures. And the cab sped on, down the hill past Wimbledon Common. This interview. Surely a man of 52, with grown-up children and hung on the line, would not be reckless. He won't want to disgrace the family, he thought. He was as fond of his father as I am of mine, and they were brothers. That woman brings destruction. What is it in her? I've never known. The cab branched off along the side of a wood, and he heard a late cuckoo calling, almost the first he had heard that year. He was now almost opposite the site he had originally chosen for his house, and which had been so unceremoniously rejected by Bosinney in favour of his own choice. He began passing his handkerchief over his face and hands, taking deep breaths to give him steadiness. Keep one's head, he thought, keep one's head. The cab turned in at the drive which might have been his own, and the sound of music met him. He had forgotten the fellow's daughters. I may be out again directly, he said to the driver, or I may be kept some time. And he rang the bell. Following the maid through the curtains into the inner hall, he felt relieved that the impact of this meeting would be broken by June or Holly, whichever was playing in there, so that with complete surprise he saw Irene at the piano and Jolyon sitting in an armchair, listening. They both stood up. Blood surged into Soames' brain, and all his resolution to be guided by this or that left him utterly. The look of his farmer forebears, dogged Forsytes down by the sea, from superior Dorset back, grinned out of his face. Very pretty, he said. He heard the fellow murmur, This is hardly the place. We'll go to the study, if you don't mind. And they both passed him through the curtained opening. In the little room to which he followed them, Irene stood by the open window, and the fellow close to her by a big chair. Soames pulled the door to behind him with a slam. The sound carried him back all those years to the day when he had shut out Jolyon, shut him out for meddling with his affairs. Well, he said, what have you to say for yourselves? The fellow had the effrontery to smile. What we have received today has taken away your right to ask. I should imagine you will be glad to have your neck out of Chancery. No, said Soames. You think so. I came to tell you that I'll divorce her with every circumstance of disgrace to you both, unless you swear to keep clear of each other from now on. He was astonished at his fluency, because his mind was stammering and his hands twitching. Neither of them answered. but their faces seemed to him as if contemptuous. "Well," he said, "you, Irene?" Her lips moved, but Jolyon laid his hand on her arm. "Let her alone," said Soames furiously. "Irene, will you swear it?" "No." "Oh, and you?" Still less. "So then you're guilty, are you?" "Yes, guilty." It was Irene speaking in that serene voice, with that unreached air which had maddened him so often, and, carried beyond himself, he cried, "You are a devil! Go out, leave this house, or I'll do you an injury." That fellow to talk of injuries! Did he know how near his throat was to being scragged? "A trustee," he said, "embezzling trust property, a thief, stealing his cousin's wife." "Call me what you like. You have chosen your part, we have chosen ours. Go out." If he had brought a weapon, Soames might have used it at that moment. "I'll make you pay," he said. "I should be very happy." At that deadly turning of the meaning of his speech by the son of him who had nicknamed him the man of property, Soames stood glaring. It was ridiculous. There they were, kept from violence by some secret force, no blow possible, no words to meet the case. But he could not, did not know how to turn and go away. His eyes fastened on Irene's face. The last time he would ever see that fatal face, the last time, no doubt. "You," he said suddenly, "I hope you'll treat him as you treated me. That's all." He saw her wince, and with a sensation not quite triumph, not quite relief, he wrenched open the door, passed out through the hall, and got into his cab. He lolled against the cushion with his eyes shut. Never in his life had he been so near to murderous violence, never so thrown away the restraint which was his second nature. He had a stripped and naked feeling, as if all virtue had gone out of him, life meaningless, mind-striking work. Sunlight streamed in on him, but he felt cold. The scene he had passed through had gone from him already. What was before him would not materialize. He could catch on to nothing, and he felt frightened, as if he had been hanging over the edge of a precipice, as if, with another turn of the screw, sanity would have failed him. "I'm not fit for it," he thought. "I mustn't. I'm not fit for it." The cab sped on, and in mechanical procession trees, houses, people passed, but had no significance. "I feel very queer," he thought. "I'll take a Turkish bath. I've been very near to something. It won't do." The cab whirred its way back over the bridge, up the Fulham Road, along the park. "To the Hammam," said Soames. Curious that on so warm a summer day heat should be so comforting. Crossing into the hot room, he met George Forsyte coming out, red and glistening. "Hello," said George. "What are you training for? You've not got much superfluous." "Buffoon!" Soames passed him with his sideways smile. Lying back, rubbing his skin uneasily for the first signs of perspiration, he thought, "Let them laugh. I won't feel anything. I can't stand violence. It's not good for me." End of Part 3, Chapter 6. Recording by Simon Evers.
Chapter 7 of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leanne Howlett. The Forsyte Saga 2, In Chancery, by John Galsworthy. Part 3, Chapter 7. A Summer Night. Soames left dead silence in the little study. "Thank you for that good lie," said Jolyon suddenly. "Come out. The air in here is not what it was." In front of a long, high, southerly wall on which were trained peach trees the two walked up and down in silence. Old Jolyon had planted some cupressus trees at intervals between this grassy terrace and the dipping meadow full of buttercups and ox-eyed daisies. For 12 years they had flourished, till their dark spiral shapes had quite a look of Italy. Birds fluttered softly in the wet shrubbery, the swallows swooped past, with a still blue sheen on their swift little bodies. The grass felt springy beneath the feet, its green refreshed. Butterflies chased each other. After that painful scene, the quiet of nature was wonderfully poignant. Under the sun-soaked wall ran a narrow strip of garden bed full of mignonette and pansies, and from the bees came a low hum in which all other sounds were set. The mooing of a cow deprived of her calf, the calling of a cuckoo from an elm tree at the bottom of the meadow. Who would have thought that behind them, within 10 miles, London began? That London of the Forsytes, with its wealth, its misery, its dirt and noise, its jumbled stone aisles of beauty, its grey sea of hideous brick and stucco. That London which had seen Irene's early tragedy and Jolyon's own hard days. That web, that princely workhouse of the possessive instinct. And while they walked, Jolyon pondered those words. "I hope you'll treat him as you treated me." That would depend on himself. Could he trust himself? Did nature permit a Forsyte not to make a slave of what he adored? Could beauty be confided to him? Or should she not be just a visitor, coming when she would, possessed for moments which passed, to return only at her own choosing? "We are a breed of spoilers," thought Jolyon, "close and greedy. The bloom of life is not safe with us. Let her come to me as she will, when she will, not at all if she will not. Let me be just her stand-by, her perching place, never, never her cage." She was the chink of beauty in his dream. Was he to pass through the curtains now and reach her? Was the rich stuff of many possessions, the close encircling fabric of the possessive instinct walling in that little black figure of himself, and Soames, was it to be rent so that he could pass through into his vision, find there something not of the senses only? Let me, he thought, let me only know how not to grasp and destroy. But at dinner there were plans to be made. Tonight she would go back to the hotel, but tomorrow he would take her up to London. He must instruct his solicitor, Jack Herring. Not a finger must be raised to hinder the process of the law. Damages exemplary, judicial strictures, costs, what they liked. Let it go through at the first moment, so that her neck might be out of Chancery at last. Tomorrow he would see Herring. They would go and see him together. And then, abroad, leaving no doubt, no difficulty about evidence, making the lie she had told into the truth. He looked round at her, and it seemed to his adoring eyes that more than a woman was sitting there. The spirit of universal beauty, deep, mysterious, which the old painters, Titian, Giorgione, Botticelli, had known how to capture and transfer to the faces of their women, this flying beauty seemed to him imprinted on her brow, her hair, her lips, and in her eyes. And this is to be mine, he thought. It frightens me. After dinner they went out on to the terrace to have coffee. They sat there long, the evening was so lovely, watching the summer night come very slowly on. It was still warm, and the air smelled of lime blossom, early this summer. 2 bats were flighting with the faint mysterious little noise they make. He had placed the chairs in front of the study window, and moths flew past to visit the discreet light in there. There was no wind, and not a whisper in the old oak tree 20 yards away. The moon rose from behind the copse, nearly full, and the 2 lights struggled, till moonlight conquered, changing the colour and quality of all the garden, stealing along the flagstones, reaching their feet, climbing up, changing their faces. "Well," said Jolyon at last, "you'll be tired, dear. We'd better start. The maid will show you Holly's room," and he rang the study bell. The maid who came handed him a telegram. Watching her take Irene away, he thought, "This must have come an hour or more ago, and she didn't bring it out to us. That shows. Well, we'll be hung for a sheep soon." And opening the telegram, he read: Jolyon Forsyte, Robin Hill. Your son passed painlessly away on June 20th. Deep sympathy. Some name unknown to him. He dropped it, spun round, stood motionless. The moon shone in on him. A moth flew in his face. The first day of all that he had not thought almost ceaselessly of Jolly. He went blindly towards the window, struck against the old armchair, his father's, and sank down onto the arm of it. He sat there huddled forward, staring into the night. Gone out like a candle flame, far from home, from love, all by himself in the dark. His boy, from a little chap always so good to him, so friendly, 20 years old and cut down like grass, to have no life at all. I didn't really know him, he thought, and he didn't know me, but we loved each other. It's only love that matters. To die out there, lonely, wanting them, wanting home. This seemed to his Forsyte heart more painful, more pitiful than death itself. No shelter, no protection, no love at the last. And all the deeply rooted clanship in him, the family feeling and essential clinging to his own flesh and blood, which had been so strong in old Jolyon, was so strong in all the Forsytes, felt outraged, cut, and torn by his boy's lonely passing. Better far if he had died in battle, without time to long for them to come to him, to call out for them, perhaps, in his delirium. The moon had passed behind the oak tree now, endowing it with uncanny life, so that it seemed watching him. The oak tree his boy had been so fond of climbing, out of which he had once fallen and hurt himself, and hadn't cried. The door creaked. He saw Irene come in, pick up the telegram and read it. He heard the faint rustle of her dress. She sank on her knees close to him, and he forced himself to smile at her. She stretched up her arms and drew his head down on her shoulder. The perfume and warmth of her encircled him. Her presence gained slowly his whole being. End of Part 3, Chapter 7. Recording by Leanne Howlett.